We're on the very last session of the day. For those of you who've been with us all through the day, it's the end of a rich and interesting day, but a long day. Others will come back to this at another time. We've got two panelists joining me for this last session. One is Jill Koenig, Transformation Director at Arup University. Jill is the author of Catastrophe and Systematic Change, Learning from the Grenfell Tower Fire and Other Disasters. This is in the little bio here, but I'll just read it out because it's very important. It combines her decades of experience consulting organizations in high hazard industries to build the leadership and culture, in reference again to culture here, to prevent catastrophic events, with a deeply personal connection to the 2017 fire, because from 2011 to 2014, Jill lived on the 21st floor of Grenfell, and 7 of her immediate neighbours were among the 72 deaths there. In April 2022, Jill joined Arup University as Transformation Director, working to shape a university that enables Arup and its clients to create a sustainable world. With me also, Jill's online, but with me also in the studio is Paul Finch, and he's the former editor of AJ, will be known to everybody listening, I'm sure, former chair of CABE, and he's the founder of World Architecture Festival, with all that's achieved over the years. He launched the AJ Retrofit Awards in 2010, and he initiated the Fire Conference last year and talked to me about it before we got underway with the very first of those. I like to refer to Paul as one of the great friends of the profession and the industry, and indeed the keeper of confidences. So here we go. Jill, would you like to kick off with a 5-minute introduction, and then I'm going to ask Paul to do the same thing, and then we're going to have a conversation around the talking points of the day.
I was set up to come with reflections from listening to previous sessions. So I have all of these post-its, which I made during listening to sessions, certainly this morning. I think one of the things that struck me is how words like culture are used a lot, but I question if people really understand what they mean. So we go, well, the culture needs to change, or that'll drive culture change. And I worry that we don't interrogate particularly the kind of leadership that's needed to change culture and the competencies that are needed to take culture. And specific things that came up this morning are things like collaboration across the supply chain, making sure that you understand the risks is a critical part of that. So there's assurance across supply chains. There's creating psychological safety so that people can raise concerns, even if commercial or contractual complexities would pull against that. So I think from my perspective, listening to the conversation, I mean, it was interesting. I wasn't in the last couple of sessions, but this morning's conversation is, I just don't think in the industry in general, I mean, and this is design specifically or architect specifically, but I think it goes broader, that we're interrogating enough about what we mean by culture and how you change culture, because it's not just by changing regulations.
Well,
that would be what I...
First, yeah, that came first in the panel discussion, and Jane Duncan raised it, and I asked at the end of that session, what do we mean by culture change, and if there is something wrong, what was wrong with it, and what should be done to put it right, and how do you set about doing that, because it's so easy to talk about, but it's very much more difficult to fix. And I asked the question, is this a culture of responsibility which should be imbued in students in the first week of the first term of the first year of their college existence, because that culture of professional responsibility is critical. Paul, a few words before we kick off with discussion.
Well, I like to think about the founding fathers of American independence, and one of their slogans was "No taxation without representation." And I think the position that designers are in the current construction and client, call it culture, for want of a better word, is their slogan ought to be no responsibility without authority. And I think that if the authority doesn't exist, then why does the responsibility exist? And we have this bizarre situation where the people who are primarily responsible contractually for the delivery of buildings, especially under design build contracts, which is most significant buildings these days, do they carry indemnity insurance? No, unless it's for some very specific design thing that they've taken on, which will generally be passed on to some sort of subcontractor. And indeed, architects and designers generally, yes, they are targets. They've got insurance. You've got a 19th century culture of joint and several liability. So the last person standing is the one that gets sued, and the last person standing is the one with the insurance policy. So we've created this very curious situation where responsibility and authority have been, I think, muddled. And the other thing that is noticeable, I think, since really the sort of rise of new contractual arrangements, a design and build culture, which, let's face it, the old culture of the RIBA traditional contract was no bed of roses. I mean, you know, famously described, the JCT contract famously described as a farrago of obscurities. What exactly does a periodic inspection mean? It's all completely fluid and undefined. And in some ways, the contractual situation now is slightly more defined. But the real problem, which I think we've seen at Grenfell and we see it everywhere, is, and I think it's fair to call it, it's like an anti-culture of risk transfer. Nobody wants to stand up to be counted if they can shuffle off their responsibilities and their liabilities onto somebody else down the line. And at worst, what this means is that responsibility and liability, where there's insurance cover that can pay it out, actually moves down and down and down to people who are least able and least equipped to carry it out. And in a way, I kind of despair about the position that design professionals find themselves in, because I think they get kicked from pillar to post. And until we can re-establish some notion of responsibility and authority being in balance, then we're going to continue to have a problem. I'll just say one other thing on this, which is that construction lawyers, who by their own lights, of course, are only responsible to their clients, busy themselves coming up with more and more onerous clauses requiring, for example, architects, if they want the job, to take responsibility for the design mistakes of other people in the design team not appointed by the architect. Now, I think this is unethical. And we're in a horrible position where there are too many people who sort of behave like jackals, and as long as they're protecting their corner and their little piece of the action, they don't care who else they hurt or the overall effect that has on projects as complete systems, including, of course, health and safety.
Jill, looking back, have you been with us all through the day?
Not this afternoon. I had to go to another meeting, but this morning, yes.
Oh, so you had this morning. Are there any particular issues that stand out in your mind that came through the morning? We mentioned the one of a culture of responsibility with Jane and the other panelists there, Alan and Peter. Any other particular issues that came floating to the surface for you?
Well, I think probably building on what Paul says, although I probably have a different take on it. But so I think there's the whole legal and contractual ownership, if you want, of risk, and I think that's what you're speaking to. But when you talk about the consequences of something going wrong, it needs to be collectively owned. So if you're working on a complex project with a complex supply chain, everybody in the supply chain understands their part of the system in a particular way. And unless you're sharing and collaborating and collectively creating a picture and understanding of risk, you won't build a safe building if you think of it from a systems perspective. And I joined the built environment, so I worked in high hazard industries beforehand to learn more about the nuances and how the built environment works. So and I'm at the beginning of that learning process. But I keep going back to just before Grenfell. I was with a client doing a very complex project, and they'd brought the entire supply chain together for 2 days. And what we worked on was where would the pinpoints or problems come up. This is before the project had started. Where would contractual issues get in the way of understanding risk? Where would people not feel free to share? And this was sponsored by the most senior people who held the money. And before they even got into the project, they had processes set up to make sure that they could collectively speak about and own risk. And that's just so far removed from any of the conversations we're even having in the built environment. And that troubles me. So that's one thing. The other question that I had as I was listening to the conversation was, and looking at the questions in the chat, was I wonder what survivors and bereaved from Grenfell would think about the conversations and the questions and the level of conversation 5.5 years next month after Grenfell. That was just the other thought that I kept having as I went through the day. Right. I'm not sure it would be a really good response.
I've got one interesting point here, I think. I've had the privilege of having to work around the world quite a lot with Americans, sometimes looking at projects in America, but extensively in Australia and China, where I was sent to work with our offices out there. China was very interesting. Without going into too much of the detail about that, I remember a memorable occasion with one of the directors of China State Construction Bureau 8, and they have 8 different bureaus there. And these are huge companies, absolutely huge companies. I mean, they built 20,000 miles of overland railway in about 10 years. Shanghai had no underground system in 1980, and it got the biggest in the world by 2001. And this director said to me, I won't mimic the accent, but he said in very good English, "You're different to us. When we look at risk, we put our arms around it. When we get problems, we put our arms around them and solve it together. You package it up and pass it to other people." And I think this is a very, very important issue. And I feel very strongly that architects' work has been packaged up and taken from them and given to others downstream when that should not have happened. And many, if not most architects would have said, that is not what we wish to happen. That for various reasons, often to do with time, sometimes to do with fees, concept design has been taken, perhaps design development has been taken, but production information has gone elsewhere, further down the line, or when they did get to it, they got to it too late. And I'll just offer you the simple example. What would you say of a surgeon in a hospital who said, well, the operation's gone wrong because we started it too early, the anaesthetist wasn't here, And we had to finish without proper inspections, and so did the person up. I mean, you'd say that was terrible. So surely we must have a better control. And this goes back to the previous Bill Fisher commentary. We must have better control over what we do so that we're calling it if it's not right.
I think to go back to your very pertinent point about, well, what would the survivors and the bereaved at Grenfell think about these ongoing discussions? Well, the first, I think they'd be enormously disappointed, as I think everybody is, that the intervention of COVID has delayed the reporting of the inquiry, because, you know, we're still waiting for the second report, which is going to be really critical, I think, for the future arrangements of the construction sector and the relationship between parties, and the way that the sort of golden thread of information which ought to prevent that sort of catastrophe ever happening. We're still waiting for that, and I think that is extremely frustrating. Ditto the report which was mentioned earlier today into testing procedures and what it is that designers can rely on in terms of technical information about whether products are safe or not. That report by Paul Morell, a former construction SAR in government, so, you know, a professional QS, head of Davis Langdon in his day. So a real industry player taken into government. They went back to him and said, can you do a report about testing procedures and certification? He delivered that on time as asked by autumn 2021. We still haven't seen it. And I find this really, you know, what is the delay about that? Because the point was that was produced sort of during and immediately after COVID, and was done, and was quite finite and quite focused. And I'm baffled as to why we're still waiting to see the results of that report.
We're not waiting for the report because it's done.
The report is done.
Publication.
Well, we're waiting for the publication of it, and one has to say, I think the suspicion is that right at the heart of the whole Grenfell issue, and applying to many, many, many other high-rise residential buildings across the country, was the government's official advice on how you could meet building regulations. Was it right or wasn't it? And I think, you know, it's not unreasonable to say at this stage, well, at best it was ambiguous and at worst it was wrong. But until we get that second report from the judge, we're still a bit in the dark about that. If I can just pick up on Jill's collaboration point, there have been attempts in the past to say, well, what are the structural ways in which you can get this a kind of really pretty much 100% collaboration on projects? Well, it has been tried. It was tried, for example, on Terminal 5 at Heathrow. And one of the characteristics of that was that there was a sort of no-blame culture for mistakes of any party to the contract. So if you realise you've made an error, it was hands up, and you weren't sued and you weren't penalised. You might not share with any financial benefit from any bonuses for finishing on time and within budget. But it did create a kind of culture where collaboration was very evident. And there were 2 points about that. Firstly, it was client-led, because if the person with the money doesn't back it, it's not going to happen. And secondly, it involved single project insurance. And I think this was quite a popular idea in government. I mean, it's some decades ago now, but it's never really gone away. If you wanted to inject some kind of sort of financial backup and a feeling that we're all in this together, single project insurance is a pretty smart way of doing it, because it's client-led. There is a clear sense of direction, and of course the insurers get pretty closely involved with the nature of that project itself. We contrast that with what the insurance industry has done as a generality to all sorts of architects and engineers who don't do high-rise buildings. They don't use aluminium cladding products. They do conventional small to medium-sized buildings, but they're still getting stuffed on their indemnity fees. This must be an area for consideration.
Another thing that came up today, I don't know whether you've got any view on this, Jill, it might be outside your normal territory, but it came up, and that is the one of prescriptive regulations. When I started my career, we had the London Building Acts and the constructional bylaws, and they told you what you had to do. Now, you could apply for a waiver, that's certainly the case, but generally speaking, they were very, very prescriptive. The building regulations moved to a non-prescriptive guidance system. You can't have a waiver there, you have a relaxation or a dispensation. You relax the guidance or you dispense with it, but that's a difficult process. But I think that the American system is prescriptive, the British system is not prescriptive. And the argument for it has been, well, we get more innovation because we've not got a prescriptive system. But certainly I'd be interested in revisiting that one at the end of the day because it came up with a very serious point earlier on.
I have views on things, but I do actually have quite a lot of views on prescriptive or outcome-based, performance-based regulation. So overall, I think there's one of the myths I talk about in my book is that regulations guarantee safe outcomes, whether they're prescriptive or not. Regulations are reactive, so they don't guarantee safe outcomes. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't comply. I'm just saying we need to guard against this mythology that if we tick all the boxes, it equals a safe outcome. And I think particularly with increasing complexity and an increasing complexity of both supply chains and of what we're building and the amount of materials that we have, prescription becomes difficult. It's easy for a normal build with normal materials, right? So maybe I don't know. Some of you might know of a colleague of mine, Susan Lamont, who does a lot in fire safety. She's in the Middle East, and her and I have spoken a lot about this. Is do you end up with kind of two codes where there's a standard build that's quite prescriptive, and then there's a much more kind of outcome-based approach for innovative buildings? Because probably most of what we build, you could be quite prescriptive. And especially, I think you can't separate this notion of regulation from competence. So part of the problem, I think, with Grenfell is that competence didn't keep up with the ambiguity of regulations. So if you're in a state that I think we're in right now, where you don't have high levels of competence, then I think there's probably an argument that more prescriptive regulations make sense. But again, I don't think, nothing I ever think is clear cut, because I think we operate in a complex world. One of the things that was mentioned this morning, I can't remember in what session, is we need to think about the principles and the intent of regulation, and are we complying with the principles and the intent as much as are we tick boxing all of the approved documents or checklists, etc., etc.
Right.
It was probably a bit of a rambly response, but there we go.
No, it's not at all. I think, quite frankly, I think I hit gold. I didn't expect you necessarily to have that clearer view on it, and so that was rich there. But I don't want to ask Paul to answer the same question. I want to move it on to another part of that same point. I think you talked about competencies, and I think we have two things now. We've got knowledge and skill that the professional designer, be they an engineer or service engineer or architect, are expected to have. And then we've got a culture of professionalism in the delivery of that. And I always like to use there the example of, what is a professional? It's not somebody who's to play football. It's not somebody who's selling cars. It's somebody who's got knowledge and skill which the user or purchaser doesn't usually have, and it's delivered in first and foremost their best interest. I mean, that's many might disagree with me, but I'd like to hold that there. But that does require a cultural approach to the whole thing. So I go back to college, and I think all through the day we've had the conversation about competency, whether you're the person on the scaffolding fitting and making that thing work, making sure it's in properly, fixed properly, it's going to do the job, the cavity barrier is the right way up and all the rest of it, or you're designing it, you've got to have competence. But we've seen a situation where there's been a decline in the interest and the ability to teach technology in schools of architecture over the last 25 years. I know that is a fact. There's been a decline in that interest and a decline. Some colleges, they haven't got the budget for it. They can't employ practicing architects or engineers. Others will have other reasons, bigger curriculum. Of course, they've done so much in the areas of eco-sustainable design. They've done so much in the areas of IT and new forms of communication. But the core issue goes back to, do we teach technology and construction as people move through college? And I think that one becomes an absolutely key one. And it links back to a second thing, which came up in a conference I was in Madrid 2 weeks ago, which is architectural education at university a vocational course exclusively or not? When I went to college, we were all going to be architects. I fully accept people who move into different careers, but goodness me, surely the course is in preparation, in principle, for a vocational career as architects. Paul?
Well, I think what you say is true, that the status of technical teaching is not the same as it was. But I think that's partly because of a kind of complicit contract, it's not quite the right word, between the design professions and the delivery industry about who does what. I would posit that the decline of technical teaching in schools of architecture is partly the result of the increasing claims of the construction sector and niche consultants and specialists to be doing those things that might previously have been done by architects. You know, in the 19th century, the architects expelled the measurers from the RIBA, so they kind of got out building economics. In the early 20th century, they created a new niche profession called planners. So fast forward, and now we have any scheme of any complexity needs to have planning consultants, where when I started writing about architecture 50 years ago, the architects were the planning consultants. Colonel Seifert was employed by developers because you got a planning permission with him. These days, he will be required to have a boutique consultant sitting at the same table, advising him what to do. So I think there's a sort of there's this back and forth relationship between all these sectors, which is probably inevitable, but it's not unavoidable. The Building Safety Act essentially makes the Architects Registration Board responsible for education, probably in a more specific way than previous legislation. And I think actually the Registration Board is going to have to get to grips with this, and the RIBA will take the consequences of not being especially consulted over these matters, actually. So there's a sort of, there's a kind of a debate inside the profession about what is appropriate there. The other point I would make about this is that somebody used the phrase plan, manage and monitor as a description of the processes by which Grenfell was created along with any other significant building. For plan, I think we can say plan, design, manage and monitor. And I think one of the things about regulation, which is why it's never going to be the answer, is just because you've got a regulation Did anybody pay any attention to it? And if the answer is no, then what was the point of the regulation? You can write regulations till the cows come home. And one interesting thing I thought was said today, amongst the many interesting things, was a point made about the recording of what is done on site, given that no architect, and actually no clerk of works, because they don't exist anymore, can actually look at everything all the time to make sure that what's being designed is actually being built and that it's in conformity. But guess what? A digital camera can. And I was thinking to myself, you know, for every cavity barrier that actually wasn't installed properly, or for every fire stop that was missing, what happens if, as part of the process and as part of conformity with regulation, it has to be recorded? Now, you can say, okay, well, you could fiddle the images, but actually that's quite difficult. And if you really want to know what is behind the facade, wouldn't it be useful to have a digital photographic record of everything that was behind the facade, because it was recorded as it was delivered? And I think that that chimes with Judith Hackett's brilliant report on reform of the building regulations and her desire for a golden thread of digital information. And I don't think there's any reason why that digital information shouldn't include, in some detail, exactly what was done during the construction process, thereby actually abandoning this fantasy that by turning up occasionally, the architect or anybody else can guarantee that everything has been done properly. And I think that's a very specific, useful line to pursue. And I'd be interested, as a practicing architect, in Paul Hyatt's view on this. That you know, if you're involved as an expert witness on cases where who knows what's behind the facade, wouldn't it be great if you actually had a digital record from the specialist subcontractors who did the installation?
Well, possibly, but you and I have talked about this before, and you know that I'm not that enthusiastic about it, because I keep going back to saying what I'd like is fewer people responsible for checking and more people who know what they're doing it properly, and doing it with a commitment to ensuring that it is properly done. So we're back to that culture of responsibility and the capability. I am going to do it right because I know it's important to do it right and I know how to do it. But I do think the great thing that comes off, and we'll hand this one to Jill to perhaps settle between us, but I do think the great thing that comes with the photographic record is that if somebody knows that everything that they do is being recorded, you know, you've got to step back, have it photographed, seal it up, cover it up, install it, step back, have it photographed, seal it up and cover it up. If that is happening, people are likely to get it right, provided that they are told beforehand what they have to do so that they've got the skills to do the job properly in the first instance. Jill?
Well, a couple of things. So firstly, on to the recording of stuff, I just don't understand why we don't record all of that as evidence, and we've got digital capability to do it. So I don't understand, and I'm sure there are multiple reasons why not, but I'm kind of like, even before Grenfell, but particularly post Grenfell, why people are just not doing that, because it's so easy to do. And if you have proof that you've done it correctly, then great, you know, you won't have any problems. So that's what I'd say about that. But I want to pick up on something about culture, because I still think, so, you know, use the notion of a culture of responsibility or a culture of professionalism. So I'm going to read a definition. There's a particular person by the name of Edgar Schein, whose work I use a lot on culture, and the atomic energy unit, I can't remember what it's called, defines culture as cultures are learned patterns of beliefs, values, assumptions, and behavioral norms that manifest themselves at different levels of observability. And I think we don't think about what research has been done into the attitudes and beliefs of the building profession since Grenfell. How are we unpacking that? Where's the evidence to show that that's changed? NASA uses knowledge, skills, and attitude to measure competence. So where are we? Yes, of course we should be doing stuff in at university, even in schools around. But for me, it's much more about the leadership, the morals, the ethics, the attitudes, the beliefs, and change. So my life is working in change, and how I think about change is it lies in your access to change lies in dissonance. It lies in areas where things aren't lined up as they should be. And if we think about the contractors on site calling the residents rebel, plus the RBKC calling the residents rebel residents, and the narratives, etc., that they use to silence people, which is indicative of attitudes in the built environment and housing. And I'm kind of like, but what have we done to understand that? What have we done to assess whether that's changed? What are the attitudes of the architectural profession? How have those changed? Where is the evidence and work that we're doing on culture? Because I don't see it. I just don't see it.
Well, that's very interesting.
Residents, and I'm kind of like, but residents aren't the problem here.
Well, that's very interesting. I think of two things in response to that. I mentioned earlier today, firstly, Volvo cars. They were known for the quality of their products. At the time when British Leyland cars had their doors falling off as they left the factory, Volvo cars were produced very high standard products. It wasn't a better designed car than the Austin Cambridge. It just happened to be robust and to last well because it was well built. And Volvo cars were built by teams. People didn't sit on a production job line just doing something. Teams of people would build their cars, and you could track a multi-car to a particular team. That was key. The second thing I think about is the Japanese with what was called, I think, their toolbox discussion in the morning, or they sat on the stools and they would have explained to them. And I go right back to Bill Kelly, a great site manager at Waits Construction when I was involved in the construction of the Lacey designed Crown Reach development. Bill Kelly was a fantastic site manager, as was Ted Ellis, another one I knew from Jarvis. And these people, and Ed Sabavel of McAlpines, I used to spend time, because I was seconded to his office, to work in his office on site for 1 year by Cedric Price, Ed Sabavel. And you would listen to these people talking to their foreman about the drawings that they had got and briefing them about what was important to get right. These were people who had building under their fingernails, really did. So I think I go back time and again to saying this culture must be, you talk about leadership, morals, attitudes and ethics, absolutely right. And those people that I'm just talking about had those instincts to pursue those characteristics, as do so many in the industry today. I am absolutely sure of that.
I think it's the fact is, since Grenfell, it's just been panic stations for the construction sector, and particularly volume house builders, and the kind of the political imperatives and the setting up of compensation funds, and indeed the rash of scaffolding all over the country, of house builders really realizing that they themselves need to check the cladding on those blocks, because actually they don't have any idea what was done and what wasn't done, which is, I would repeat my plea, which I'm very pleased to hear you support, that it should just be routine that all these things should be photographed and recorded. I don't see otherwise how you can possibly start to say whether things are safe or if they've got a problem. I mean, far better to look at a set of photographs and have to put up scaffolding rigs and start tearing down chunks of walls. So I don't think there's been, in truth, I don't think there's been any cultural change so far. It's more a response to a realization that we have a sort of a moral and an industry crisis that's been waiting to happen for a long time or to emerge, and it has emerged. However, I think there are enough signs on the horizon not to be too gloomy about this. I mean, I would start by saying that actually, as with most industries, you know, most of the construction industry consists of people who want to do a good job. They get up in the morning to try to do a competent job, and they're proud of what they do. You know, if you look at despite all the problems, you know, if you look at, say, the British Construction Industry Awards, which are awards in the round, they're not design awards, they're awards for team performance. You know, client, contractor, architect, they all get interviewed on site when people go to see them, and they are kind of life-affirming projects, both buildings and civil engineering. I think the change which is taking place now is primarily politically led, because I think that the politicians finally woke up to the fact that the construction industry is not what it should be in certain respects, and particularly in relation to housing, and particularly in relation to very high-rise construction. And the truth is, I think, that people like the Centre for Window and Cladding Technology have known for years that there will be problems with high-rise construction. I don't think they anticipated it being fire, actually. But, for example, if you take the old National House Building Council certificates that guaranteed the building would be okay for, I can't remember if it was 5 or 10 years, most of their work was done with conventional construction. And of course, the problems that might occur with cladding, leave aside fire, but in terms of repair and degradation and possible failure, would never occur after 5 or 10 years, or rarely. But it would occur in the lifetime of people buying a 99-year lease. And I think it was a kind of dirty little secret. And I think that whole question of high-rise and design and construction has now come under the spotlight, you know, for tragic and horrible reasons, i.e. Grenfell. But I think it has opened up this whole question about how we treat construction of something new. As a final curiosity about this, I've sort of looked for evidence of where the sort of thing that happened at Grenfell, does this happen in contemporary office design? You know, the same sort of architects, the same sort of contractors, the same building control system, the same planning system. I don't find the same problems. It may be that there are some that are going to emerge in respect of cladding, but I'm sort of curious as to why it is that the housing sector seems to be such a poor performer. And I suspect it may have something to do with the fact that the culture of volume house building and high-rise building, which wasn't very common in this country until the last, say 40 years, whether that has something to do with the condition we now find ourselves in.
Well, let's not, as we end, forget all those fantastic pieces of work that do exist out there and all the tremendous schemes that we do witness. But before asking you for a closing remark, Jill, and then I'll make one of my own if I may, I'm just going to read this point that's come in. It's not a question, it's a point. It really is very good at the end of the day. It's from Mark Taylor, and he says, when, I hope some of you won't mind me using a motor car reference again, but it's Mark's, when the Ferrari team decided to revive their fortunes when Schumacher joined them, that's of course Michael Schumacher, one of the key components of their success was a no-blame culture. People were freed from worries about self-protection to offer their best ideas and work and not worry about mistakes. Schumacher's 7 world championships stemmed from that. Then he turns to NASA and says, they had the opposite culture at that time when the space shuttle exploded just after takeoff. Very, very sobering remark from Mark at the end of this day. Jill, your final remarks.
So I'll say 2 things. So one thing is on the NASA example is with the Challenger. That one of the findings was that the norms had moved from prove safe to prove unsafe. And I think we're in that situation in the built environment.
Wow.
Is, you know, to
Wow.
your point about you know, proving safe. So we just prove that this is safe. We are now in much more of a narrative of prove unsafe. So just to make that link, but I'm going to actually end reading a quote, which was Richard Millett, who was QC to the counsel to the Grenfell inquiry. So to Martin Moore-Beck, his closing statements back in July. Which just profoundly impacted me, is every decision, every act, omission, interpretation, understanding, practice, policy, protocol affects someone somewhere, someone who is unknown and unseen, but who is an adored child, a beloved sister, a respected uncle, a needed mother. And I just think we should keep that in our minds when we make decisions.
Well, of course, and that goes back to the aeroplane or the ship analogy that I was mentioning. When you get on that aeroplane, you rely on the people who carried out the maintenance. You rely on the people who've been trained to run air traffic control. You rely on the pilot. You rely on everybody. And you'll never meet them, and they'll never meet you. But the construction industry, which is a great industry, has got to actually develop that kind of level of confidence amongst those, which is everybody, who use it. I'm not against photographic records of work as that proceeds, so I don't want to be misquoted on that by anybody who's listening to this, but I would wish to restate the point. I would like the emphasis to be on getting the skills to get it right in the first place, and then we can record it with great joy. My closing remark actually is a very simple one. It's to thank everybody, not least you, Jill, for bringing this to a close today with this kind of 50,000 foot overview, because of the wide range of experience that you've got introducing such issues as leadership, morals, attitudes and ethics, because they are critical to all that all of us do. And I'm not talking about professional architects, I'm talking about everybody down the line, to those that install that cladding or that have a component in a building which won't do the wrong things, including fall off. But I'm just going to make one comment, if I may, about the conversation around ARB and RIBA and the training of architects. We should never forget two things. The one is that the exam is the RIBA exam. It owns the exam, it made the exam. RIBA Part 1 and 2 and 3 belong to the RIBA, and they vested in universities the right to teach and to bring students to a standard equivalent to Part 1, 2 and 3. And that system ran very, very well for many decades. I'm not saying it should be frozen. No, it evolves over time. It ran very well for many decades, and it was the backbone of a system which produced architects of a reputation that is distinguished around the world from this country. We've seen great architects work out of these shores right around the world. That's one very important point, I think, about that. And the second is that design and build, we should never forget that the design and build was a convenience. It was introduced to deal with a terrible situation, which was inflation running at 28% in the construction industry. So if you start the building at £1 million contract value and it takes a year to build, it'll be 1.28 when you're finished. 10 million will become 12.8, etc. So design and build was brought in at a time when inflation in the country was at 16%, and in the building industry it was at 28%. Around about 1979, 80, 81, that's when it took off. It was brought in to enable builders to start on site earlier so that developers could get buildings done more cheaply. And what was achieved there was an earlier start on site with abbreviated information and risk transferred to builders. That was the whole purpose of it. Risk transfer to builders. And I'm not blaming or criticizing builders in that. I'm saying the procurement system was nothing to do with design and build of aircraft or ships. It was to transfer risk to builders when work had not been properly seen through to a point in which they should be assuming that responsibility. Somewhere down the line, you've got to have the time to do the work properly. If you're going to give that responsibility to builders and they're going to engage people who are trained to design, then the builders need the time to develop their work. They cannot be given a standing start, shotgun goes off and they're away, and already 3 months before they've even begun the job. So we need to remember that the procurement system that was, I think, flawed from the day it started with design and build, which isn't to say design and build is wrong, but you've got to do it the right way if you're going to do it. The procurement system is absolutely critical, and we should never forget that RIBA exam produced generations of very distinguished architects out of these shores, and it became the model for training around the world. It's been a great day. I thank all the speakers, and also at the end, thank you, Jill and Paul, for bringing this to a close. Now I've got, I think, some very closing notes. Where are they at the end? Yes, here we are. The HA Fire Safety Design Conference will return in 2023, providing quality need-to-know subject matter in an easy, accessible way. The conference is scheduled to take place in November 2023, and the content for the conference will be made available on demand. So thank you all for attending all day. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have, and we'll see you next year.